Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens.
What's up, y'all? Today we bring you the first of a special two-part series on the secret history of chemistry. But first, we want to do a couple quick plugs at the top of the episode. Coffee with Comrades is affiliated with the Revolutionary Left Radio Federation and is a proud member of the Channel Zero Network. Check out this jingle from our Cesian pals, the inimitable Rebel Steps.
After the 2016 election, a lot of us woke up to some harsh realities. In the aftermath of dark events, I came back to political work with a new sense of urgency. But after a few months of showing up to protest every weekend, I started to burn out. It didn't feel like anything was changing. In fact, maybe things were even getting worse. And it got me thinking, what comes next? Rebel Steps is a podcast about what comes next. You'll hear episodes on letter writing to political prisoners, practicing mutual aid, and creating political art. You'll hear the voices and stories of my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, NYC Books Through Bars, Anarchist Black Cross, Lower Manhattan Food Not Bombs, brand workers, and more. I'll walk you through what you can do to start plugging into movements and learning organizing skills step by step. If you've been to a march or two and you're looking to jump in, this podcast is for you. Or if you have friends looking for more, pass it on. Listen at rebelsteps.com, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast.
As always, if you enjoy this show and if these conversations and interviews speak to you, please consider signing up to support the show on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. Thanks to the generosity and mutual aid of over 90 people, Coffee with Comrades is able to keep on rolling. However you can, find and support independent media and artists. Share your comrades' art. Take 60 seconds to write a review for the podcast you love. Tell your friends about the places you go to get your news. Every little bit really, truly helps. We all need each other, now more than ever. Alright, with that out of the way, we turn to our first episode on the secret history of chemistry, featuring my dear friend Taylor Perry. Taylor and I chat about education, history, and alchemy. I sincerely hope you'll enjoy this special two-part series. So, without further ado, pour yourself a cup of coffee and check out episode 68 of Coffee with Comrades, Alchemy and Atom Bombs.
Whoa. Hey, let me ask my man over here. Hey, man, let me ask you a question, man. See if you know what's up. Pick this. Who fuses the music with no illusions, producing the blueprints? Clueless? Automator, defy the laws of nature. Electronic monolith, throw a jam upon the disc. The futuristic loop it with the quickness. Hyper-producing, hydrogen fusion liquids. Keep your distance.
This week, I am overjoyed to welcome one of my dearest friends on the show to talk about the secret history of chemistry. Welcome on Coffee with Comrades, Taylor.
Good to be here.
Dude, it's funny because I feel like we recorded this conversation, when was it, like 6 months ago? 8 months ago?
Last year, man. Last year.
It was sometime last year.
Yeah.
And it's like the fabled lost episode of Coffee with Comrades.
Just like the Philosophers Stone.
Yes, indeed, which we'll get into here in just a second. You're working on end of the semester exams with your students right now, right?
Yeah. It's pretty easy actually for me personally because I've already done all the teaching. Now they just have to hope they remembered anything. So that's.
Do you give them like a study guide or anything that?
Yeah, I give them a pretty in-depth study guide. I mean, these exams they're kind of bullshit anyway.
Right.
But there's something that needs to happen. I try and make it as easy as possible, and I usually curve them pretty generously.
Totally.
Well, these exams are worded very strangely. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, on that note, can you tell folks and listeners a little bit about your background, how you kind of got into chemistry, what teaching chemistry is like at a public high school, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I went to, so I got my degree at UCF, and at the time, I was actually really interested in mythology and world religion. So I was learning a lot about that, and that's how I sort of got introduced to alchemy and how it sort of transitioned into chemistry. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I've always thought I was a pretty good teacher, so I wanted to become a teacher, but I didn't really know what I wanted to teach. And it just kind of dawned on me that maybe I should teach chemistry. And I think if I applied a historical lens of chemistry to students, maybe they'd get into it the same way I did. So I got my degree in chemistry. Then my loans came in, but I did not yet have my actual teaching certification. So I had to fly up to Maine, where I got a job in environmental, like at an environmental chem lab. So people would send me water and soil and like literal garbage and just ask me to figure out what was in it. And I would have to be like, hey, this is okay to drink or throw away or whatever.
What were some of the craziest things that you got like sent by? Like what kind of things did you uncover during their time up there?
I'll tell you the worst thing that ever happened in that lab. And I think I'm allowed to talk about this. I don't think it's anything bad. So there's a lab near us. It's a chicken lab, which sounds weird, but basically I think they harvest something from chickens to make a certain vaccine. I don't know the specifics, but every once in a while they will send us the corpses of those chickens. But they've been they've been immolated. They're ash. It's like chicken ash. So it's a little macabre. But anyway, so they'll send us this ash, and our job basically they have to. We figure out if they're allowed to throw it away in a normal like garbage can, basically, or if they have to get it special, like taken care of by some facility that deals with hazardous waste. So I'm basically supposed to figure out what's in it, and we do something called acid leaching, which is basically where we take the ash, throw it in a jar full of acid, specifically acetic acid, and then we put it on the spinner for like 7 hours, and then we check and see if it leached out any very dangerous chemicals, essentially. The issue with that is when ash, like this specific type of ash, when it hits acid, one of the byproducts in the reaction is carbonate, which is like in soda. It's like what makes soda so bubbly. And the issue is, because it's in a sealed container overnight, as this carbonate starts to bubble up and form, all that pressure, there's no way to relieve it. And so what happened was we had like 6 jars of this stuff, and they just exploded overnight.
Jesus Christ.
And so like when I opened the door, like corpse water just like flooded through the door.
Oh God!
Yeah, it was pretty disgusting. I literally just sat outside and cried for a little bit until it was too cold, and then I went in and I just like, listen, you guys, something real bad happened, and that was like the worst. That was the worst thing ever.
Yeah,
just in general.
That's pretty fucking brutal. That's awful. But obviously you've transitioned now into teaching at public high schools here in Florida. It's the second year, is that right? I always get my math wrong, so I wanted to double check.
I mean, technically third if you count my internship. I wouldn't.
Right.
But yeah, basically second year.
So tell me what that's like. I mean, I know that you and I have talked about it before, but for listeners who may not be aware, like Florida ranks like 47th in the nation for like what they spend on public education, which is really a bummer. It's absolutely abysmal. So what's your experience been like teaching chemistry to public high school students?
I mean, I've definitely been on the like the receiving end of like the deficient in the budget. Chemistry, one of the big things as far as money goes, is like we need money for the supplies. And we need to make sure we have a working laboratory, like working sinks and a working shower. Half that stuff doesn't work. And if I order chemicals, I get yelled at by like my chemistry head. And I'm just like, well, I need them. I don't know what you want me to do. So my labs, I don't get to do as many labs as I'd like to. We have to go to a lot of meetings that could have been like easily, and you know this because you've done this, like so many meetings that could have been covered by a very quick paragraph of an email. We somehow spend 2 hours analyzing it. I don't really understand that at all.
And I know you pay for a lot of because you love doing experiments with your students. And one of the things that I really admire about you, and I've told you this before, is that like you go out of your way to like, go the extra mile, buy supplies with your own money, and like, make sure that students can have some of these really cool, euphoric, exciting, kinesthetic experiences in the laboratory. Yeah,
I mean, because that's the issue with chemistry and a lot of science at the early like high school level is it can feel very boring and dull because you're seeing it all on paper, but you're not seeing it's like the applied science. So when you do labs, it's a great way of applying what you're learning, and like there's some friggin' cool labs out there. Like we did one, I was teaching them about energy basically, and essentially when you like heat up an element, what happens is the electrons in that element actually like they climb up these things called energy levels, which, requires a lot of energy. But then when they come down, the atom releases energy via photons or light. So what happens is, because each element like can give off its own wavelengths of light, each of these elements will give off different colors in the fire. So like you can put copper in like a normal like glowing fire, and it turns like greenish blue, and it's fucking magic. Like it's wizard sorcery. That's all it is. And so like I bought a buttload of supplies for my kids, and they loved it. Like they went absolutely like hog wild. And to this day, like the energy unit is like the one that my kids consistently score higher on than any other unit, because I can show them a really dope ass like, you know, application of what we learned. So
Right.
Yeah, it's super cool.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too, like thinking about, you know, the ways that I know you and I have talked a lot about, like pedagogically, how we like to tie different types of learning experiences into the classroom. And you know, you've kind of already mentioned it a bit at the top of the episode, but for as long as I've known you, I've really admired the way that you can just kind of like plunge into a topic and just research the hell out of it. At the drop of a hat, you can just conjure up the most random facts of like Elder Scrolls lore to Warhammer Legends, which is just, you know, great. But one of the subjects, obviously, you've thrown yourself into, right, is the history of chemistry, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you pop on the show today. The thing I think is most fascinating about the way you in particular have taught chemistry, and the reason why I think it's such a disservice to so many students that we don't include different types of learning scenarios in the classroom, is that you kind of make this active effort to do a really interdisciplinary approach to lessons that reach across traditionally distinct subjects. And so I guess my question for you is, why do you think it's important pedagogically to marry discussions of history and chemistry, and how do you think your students in particular benefit from these lessons?
I think it's like twofold. Like the first thing for me is like when I was a student, I feel like I was conditioned to think of like math, science, like English and history as four very separate subjects. And each time I went into a different, you know, class, learning a different subject, I feel like I had to switch my mind a little to get into that subject.
Right.
And like the more you grow up, the more you realize just how intertwined everything is. Like you cannot have chemistry without history and without language and definitely without math. You really can't have one without the other in any way. Like even in English, when you learn about logic, you know this more than I do. There are literal like mathematical logic structures to having an argument, if you want a good, you know, sit down argument that doesn't end up with people screaming,
Totally.
or having logical fallacies. Like you really can't have one course without the other, and I feel like in order for like kids to understand that they don't have to necessarily learn information and then just forget it when they go to the next class. It's all interconnected. So I try my very best to introduce that idea into the class. I try and give so many real world examples of the chemistry that they're learning. I try and tell them like who developed this idea and what was it used for, and is there any like juicy drama that went on. For instance, okay, we were just learning about something called Lewis structures, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but you know, in order to help them understand it, I told them a lot about this guy named Gilbert Lewis, who basically he had never like won a Nobel Prize for a lot of his work, but one of his colleagues, who was also a rival, ended up like making a book based off of Gilbert's research, and that guy ended up getting the Nobel Prize instead of him. And anyway, so over dinner, Gilbert Lewis found out about this, or maybe it was lunch actually. And what happened was Gilbert Lewis went back to his lab, and he was never heard from again. And the next time anyone found him, they found like a corpse essentially in the lab. And what's really, really interesting is they smelled the scent of almonds, which is sort of weird because why would you smell almonds in a chemistry lab? Well, it turns out that the only like laboratory grade chemical that you would find in a lab that even smells remotely like almonds is cyanide. So a lot of people think he released cyanide gas into his lab to kill himself, essentially. So it's like, but it's a story that I know will cement itself into my kids' minds. And I will say this, like no one's sure if he actually did it or if it was just a lab accident, but still, the story itself cements itself into its kids' minds, or into my kids' minds. So again, just always marrying history with chemistry. It just helps kids always remember, like any little bit of interest or fascination that a kid has with the subject is going to foster their understanding of that subject. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my class. Whether it works or not, who knows? But I'm enjoying it. So
yeah, totally. And well, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting too about it is that like even if somebody may not be super into chemistry at this point in their life, right, maybe they are really into math, maybe they really are into history, right, and vice versa. And so you can think about the ways that these things can overlap and inform each other and make it so that students, really recognize that these things aren't somehow disparate concepts that have just been flung across a map and we're supposed to just infer independently from one another, but that rather that these things are actually like deeply interdependent and rely upon one another in order to make each other stronger.
Yeah, I agree. I have a kid who's like a total number file, and have you ever heard of like the Fibonacci sequence or the Fibonacci spiral?
Yeah, totally.
Jazz. Yeah, well, okay, so like there's like a ratio between those numbers. I think it's around 1.6. It's like a golden ratio. But like there's some like new evidence that's showing up that sort of links that number to actually like the molecular structure of water. And like, this number is like one of those sacred geometry numbers, and somehow it's also being linked with the water, which is the stuff of life. And so like there's some really like I told that to the kid, and now he's like super stoked when we do water chemistry, which is like our next unit. So yeah, you're exactly right. Like there are so many kids that I know are fixated on something, and if I can somehow find a way to like bridge their interest to like my subject area, that's amazing. Because I don't expect any kid to become a chemist when I teach them. I just expect them to get a simple like working notion of how our world works, and maybe just at least appreciate it as they go throughout their life. Just be, well-rounded individuals, Renaissance kids.
Yeah, totally. Well, I guess one place we should go is back to the beginning. Maybe we should start with discussions about alchemy. And my first question for you is, kind of obvious. What is alchemy? I imagine a lot of listeners hear that word and probably think like Harry Potter or Dungeons and Dragons or something. And, right. If I understand correctly, alchemy was actually like this legitimate thing, or rather so-called legitimate thing that was practiced at certain points in human history. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. Yeah, I guess if I had to define alchemy, so okay, when you think back to like the beginning, when you think of like ancient culture, the one thing that always seems to pop up is the term philosophy and philosophers. And like all a philosopher does, it's usually just some very wealthy, like famous person who just pontificates on things, and society loves them for it and writes down whatever they say in a book. And when it comes to philosophy, you can, I guess, philosophize on or pontificate on any subject you want. So whenever it comes to like a natural philosophy, which is literally just like, I wouldn't even call it the study of nature, but more an understanding of like how nature works. Well, that's what alchemy essentially is. It's just a branch of natural philosophy. It's essentially like what it is. It's a marriage of science and spiritualism. It has its roots in like Europe, I'd say Africa and Asia. When I say Africa, mostly like Northern Africa, like Egypt area, and China and East Asia.
So with that in mind, who are some of the great alchemists of history, and what are their stories?
So before I really get to that, I shouldn't have paused, because there is something else about alchemy. Like I want like to understand really how it starts, like the idea of alchemy itself. So alchemy, again, I said it's like it's definitely a marriage of science and spiritualism, like I said. And then one of the big reasons for that is, okay, this is like a very stupid, like mental, like just a thought experiment, okay? Like, let's say we go back to like Greco-Roman times, okay? And, a lot of the ways that like we found knowledge is based off of like observations we make about things and linking observations to other things. So for instance, okay, like when you see, like if you were to wake up one morning and you were to see a squirrel, I don't know why, but you see a squirrel, let's say your dog gets out and chases the squirrel. Is the squirrel just going to stand there? No, he's going to run. And like one thing, like an association you can make based off that is, I know that this squirrel is a living and breathing thing, and I'm also aware that the squirrel can run. So living things are capable of movement. Like that's an association you can make. And it's a pretty good association, but there's problems with that, because if you make the association that everything that can live must be able to move, or everything that can move must be alive, you're going to run into some problems. So for instance, like, if you see a tree growing, oh, the tree must be alive, and that's true. But if you see a river flowing, well, that's just physics. But again, according to this association, you might think, oh, okay, this river must be alive. Or like if you wake up one morning and you see the sun basically like traveling across the sky, you might make the inference, based off your association on movement and life, that the sun itself is a living being. And, if the sun is alive, and it doesn't take long for people to realize that the sun is also responsible for like our growth cycles and whether or not we're going to get food the next day, what are you going to think of that sun as?
Right. It's like this sort of propensity that human beings have for pattern recognition running rampant, right? Like this tool that we have for like being able to think critically turning into this thing that we utilize to make, the basis of our mythologies.
Yeah. And I mean, it's weird to think that like someone couldn't just be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just say this. Maybe we should do some research. But like the idea of empiricism doesn't come around till like way later. So basically, like a lot of ancient societies begin to think of like celestial objects like the sun and the moon and any planets that are visible. We begin to see them as actual deities, essentially, like gods. And so at the time, I want to say, and I can never remember this, but I want to say we had 8 celestial bodies that we could observe in our corner of the universe. And at the same time, we had also discovered 8 elements, okay, the first elements. And we didn't call them elements at the time, but we had discovered 8 essentially precious substances. And, if you're a Roman at the time who just makes associations like that, to them it's not a coincidence. And they began to associate each one of these 8 metals with one of the 8 gods, essentially. And in the Roman pantheon, for instance, okay, let's take iron, okay? So iron, like the metal iron, began to be associated with Mars, and we literally believe that maybe Mars, the god, gave up iron to the people on Earth. And the reasons for that is, well, if you think about it, okay, what is like Mars is the red planet, okay? And iron, like what happens when iron gets wet and is exposed to oxygen?
It rusts.
Yeah, it rusts, right? And it becomes like a reddish-brown material. So you begin to associate it with Mars. And Mars in the Roman pantheon is the god of war. And if you're going off to war, what other tool are you going to use besides an iron weapon?
Totally.
So, it's this idea that the matter that we see on Earth, okay, the matter that we work with every day, is not just some substance. It's a sacred and holy substance that has been gifted to us by the gods. And if we can understand matter and manipulation of matter, maybe we ourselves can become gods. And that's sort of how alchemy starts. It's this idea that understanding the world around us will bring us closer to spiritual enlightenment. So it's such a weird concept to me, because when I think of science, I do not think of spirituality whatsoever, but that is how it
Totally.
started, with very lofty goals in mind.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's interesting too, because like even great so-called great scientists of history have been really taken by chemistry. If I remember correctly, like wasn't Isaac Newton super into alchemy as well?
Isaac Newton was really into alchemy. It was kind of after the fact, but yeah, we really he has like a whole like mess of papers on the subject.
So who are some of those great alchemists from history, and what are some of their stories?
Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to alchemy, the issue is a lot of alchemy is a proto-science, and it comes from what we call like the Age of Antiquity, which I think it's anything up to like 300 AD, I want to say. So as such, you're going to get a lot of alchemists that might not have even existed. So for instance, the first big one, like there's 2 alchemists that I would call like legendary alchemists, in that we don't really even know if they're like, if what they did is true. The first one is Hermes Trismegistus. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but so have you ever heard of like the Hermetic Order or Hermetic text?
Yeah, that I have.
Yeah, it comes from this guy, Hermes Trismegistus. And the thing is, he's not even a guy at all. Some people believe that he's either the Egyptian god Thoth or the god Hermes from like Greco-Roman mythology, which is like, those are gods of wisdom and communication, which sort of makes sense, like why he would be like considered in like the realm of science and alchemy. He's the purported author of what's called the Hermetic Corpus, and that is basically a giant text on cosmology, astronomy, medicine, and alchemy. And that is the foundation for Hermeticism and like the Hermetic Order, and a lot of like, honestly, a lot of like Crowley sort of stuff, or even like Wiccan religions. A lot of that comes from this. So again, the thing is, we don't even know if this person existed or not. It could just be a bunch of different people, and we just call it the same person. So there's really no way of knowing.
Or it could be a god, Taylor. Taylor, it could be a god.
You're right. You're totally right. I can't argue with that. So that's just one famous pseudo alchemist. The other one, and I think this guy, the more I read this name, the more I think he actually was in the first Harry Potter film. Nicholas Flamel. I want to say that he was in the first Harry Potter, or at least his name popped up. Now he does actually have a birth and a death date, so he might be the real deal. So he's like around 1330, actually, like 1330 AD. However, he was a French scribe, so I'm assuming he had to deal with, like, he made manuscripts. I don't really know what else he did. However, legend has it that he heard he was working on developing the Philosopher's Stone, and I'll go over what that is in a minute. But he ended up, throughout his travels and like being a manuscript trader, he heard like two Jewish folk saying that they had discovered some like other ingredients. And anyway, he used those ingredients, and he is essentially credited with creating the first Philosopher's Stone. Whether that is true or not, I'm going to say no, but people believe that he faked his death and is, in fact, still alive today because he has achieved immortality and godhood through creating the Philosopher's Stone. In fact, I guess before we even go further, I should say that, I talked about how alchemists all had these like big lofty goals. There were 4 major ones. The first one that I guess we should go over is the Philosopher's Stone. And basically what that is there was an idea for a while that every single element or substance, because they didn't really call them elements, but every single substance on our planet originated from one single like super substance, basically. And from that substance, every other substance came. Just like, like from God, every other planet and substance came. And we called the substance the prima materia. And that's essentially what a Philosopher's Stone is.
That needs to be a metal album.
I know, right? There are so many words in alchemy that could be like hardcore bands. Like, I'd shit you not. In fact, I'm going to say another one that it would be a great band name. But so the prima materia, that's what a Philosopher's Stone was, essentially. It was a rock composed of the prima materia. And because it contained every known substance, it was believed that if you held up a substance you didn't want to that stone, it could transmute that stone into something even better. So, like, you've probably heard of, like, turning lead into gold. It comes from that idea. Maybe if I hold up this chunk of lead, which is super common, it'll transmute this into gold, which didn't happen because that would destroy the economy. And we already have our president's already doing that. So,
yeah.
But zing, no. So that's one of the things, Philosopher's Stone. There's also something, and this is a super metal name. There's something called the Alkahest, which I think would be a great band name. The Alkahest. But this is sort of a stupid one. So you know how like water can dissolve certain things, like water can dissolve salt and sugar, but I can't just stick like a chunk of metal in there and it'll dissolve it overnight. What the Alkahest is a universal solvent, essentially a super acid, something that could literally dissolve anything. But the more I think about it, the stupider that idea is, because if I have a substance that dissolves literally anything, what's going to happen if I put it in a glass container? Yeah, I was just going to
dissolve the glass container.
Yeah. And it's a great way of showing you how stupid alchemy is, because again, alchemy has a lot of lofty goals, but they're stupid goals. But the research that goes into achieving these goals is actually what ends up becoming chemistry, is the knowledge that we gain from trying to achieve these unattainable goals.
Yeah, and it's this interesting like crossover, right? Where like, know, all of these like big mistakes and like pseudoscientific like attempts turned into like some really concrete useful tools for people to like think through and problematize the world and like make actual material concrete claims about how the world functions and like the basic building blocks of life.
That's knowledge. It's like knowledge is always foundational. That's how it works. You have to have a stupid idea. Someone builds on that idea or realizes that idea is dumb, and eventually you get where we are now, which is pretty cool.
Fail well, fail often, fail better.
Exactly. You've heard of this one, the panacea.
Yep.
Yeah, basically a cure-all, essentially. Now, I believe panacea is named after either a Greek goddess or a Roman goddess, and I can never remember. But I know the goddess herself is holding like a staff with a snake entwined around it. And if you go to a lot of like health centers, you can see that symbol of the snakes around a rod. I know there's 2 different symbols they use. There's Panacea's staff, and there's also something I think called the Rod of Caduceus, unless that is her staff. I can never remember.
So
But yeah, so that's
there's
badass.
just so many. There's just so many metal like awesome names in the
fucking
history
definitely.
of chemistry.
Oh, and you've probably heard of this. The fourth great work, you've probably heard about this. The Elixir of Immortality. Can't go wrong with that one. Drink it, live forever. People believe the Philosopher's Stone was also capable of this, so maybe it's redundant. But that was the last one. Which actually brings me to an alchemist I do want to talk about. And again, this could be another legend, but I choose to believe because this is a really cool story, I think. So there was an alchemist, a Chinese alchemist by the name of Zhu Fu. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm probably going to butcher a lot of names here. But there's an alchemist by the name of Zhu Fu. And so he comes from the age of antiquity, I think somewhere around 300 BC, I want to say.
Right.
So he was a Chinese alchemist, and he was court sorcerer to the emperor of China, which is a big deal. I believe the emperor at the time was Qin Shi Huang, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but there you go. Qin Shi Huang. And Qin Shi Huang was really anti-death. He really did not want to die. He wanted to make sure his empire would last forever, and he thought only he could be the one running it. And so he was super interested in the elixir of life, or immortality in general, I should say. And so he did something kind of interesting. He felt that of all the people that he should spearhead a project he was working on, it should be Zhu Fu, because he was an alchemist, and who better acquainted with the elixir of immortality than an alchemist? And basically, he had Zhu Fu take 8,000 people, and I don't think that number's correct, because that's a lot of people. But he took 18,000 people, and they boarded a massive fleet of ships. I think they were barks. I think that was the ship. And basically, in Chinese mythology, there existed a mountain, a sacred mountain called Mount Panglai. And basically, every religion has some sort of sacred mountain, but that was China's. And they believe that on Mount Panglai, there existed these giants that had achieved immortality. And so he was basically saying, hey, Zhu Fu, I want you to sail away. Don't come back until you find this mountain. And when you find it, ask the giants about the recipe for the elixir of immortality. So, Zhu Fu goes out with these 8,000 people, and he sails, and he does find a mountain, but he doesn't find Mount Panglai. He ends up he sees Mount Fuji of Japan, and he sees Mount Fuji, and he's like, oh, that must be it. And so it's very much believed that there was a huge settlement of people in Japan around 300 BC that were led by Zhu Fu. And the reason for this is because there was something called Jomon culture in Japan, and it was a pretty big culture for like 3,000 years. But suddenly, around the same exact time, that culture just completely disappears and is replaced with a more modern culture, something very similar to Chinese culture. At the same time, a lot of new like medicinal and agricultural feats are achieved in China, and these feats are supposed to be way off. Like in human progression, they should not have come up with this technology for another like 100 years. But somehow they come up with these new farming practices and medicinal techniques, the same ones that are being practiced in China at the same time. So, in fact, Zhu Fu in Japan is heralded as a god of medicine and farming. And so a lot of these things point to, like me, that maybe this actually happened. Maybe there was a guy named Zhu Fu who was searching for this Mount Panglai and did settle on Japan with his 8,000 followers. All because of the elixir of life.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's just like it's another time where history and alchemy and chemistry, like you can see it all merging, like it's all the same, and I just think that's really, really cool. So I just want to go over a guy named Democritus real quick. He grew up in the age of antiquity as well. Now he's super important because and this is a long time ago, he develops atomic theory, which is at the time, that's insane. He basically, I don't know what he was doing, but I think he was essentially like, if I take a piece of paper, or whatever, papyrus, I have no idea, and I rip it up, there's got to be a point where I can no longer keep ripping that paper up. And there's got to be a point where that paper consists of one singular, thing of paper. And so he calls that concept the atom. And he says that all matter is made up of indivisible particles, and he named them atoms because atom means indivisible in Greek. And to this day, that is the correct theory. But at the time, Aristotle, he had maintained the four elements theory that, nature was, or all of matter was made up of four elements, in some ratio: earth, fire, wind, and water. So you got your Avatar, the Last Airbender there.
Water. Earth. Fire. Air.
But because Aristotle was more popular, his theory stuck, and so Democritus was largely forgotten to the annals of time until much later. Anyway, last alchemist, and then I'll call it, because I think we're going to get into chemistry after this. Hennig Brand, it's one of my favorite stories ever. So Hennig Brand is a German chemist, or a German alchemist, which you don't see a whole lot of, German alchemy. But he was a German alchemist. If history is correct, he was a glassmaker, because, glassmaking has a lot of chemistry in it. And he used his funds as research for a Philosopher's Stone. He wanted to develop a Philosopher's Stone, and so he's using his job as a glassmaker to fund that. Now, here's what's interesting. He also participated in the 30 Years' War, and as a result, he married a woman who was in very high standing in Germany, and he got a huge dowry, like a buttload of money. But he blew all that money on researching the Philosopher's Stone. And his wife, I don't know if she died or if they divorced, but he ended up marrying a new woman so he could get her money so that he could continue his research. So he's like a gold digger.
Christ.
He's like a legitimate gold digger.
Which is hilarious because it's the Philosopher's Stone and it's supposed to convert things to gold, and here's this motherfucker digging for gold.
And he's using all of his money trying to figure it out. I know.
That's
fucking,
so funny.
Like, stranger fucking things. This, like, it's stranger than fiction is the term, isn't it? So now he gets an idea, which I think is really interesting, okay? So remember, I told you that, like, the Philosopher's Stone is not just chemistry. Oh, it's not chemistry at all. It's alchemy. It's a spiritual conquest, okay? It is developing this sacred stone. And at the same time, humans are very arrogant people, and, we're religious, and we believe that we are also the most sacred beings on earth, like, because gods love us the most. They're most interested in us, and they created us, and we lord all over the world. And so he believed that, hey, if I'm going to make the Philosopher's Stone, which is a sacred material, I need sacred ingredients. And what's more sacred than the human body? And so, like, he didn't, like, chop a bunch of people or anything, but he took a buttload of urine, just, like, so much pee. And he started working with pee. He thought the secret was in urine. And so what he did was, and this is around, I think this is like 1650, maybe 1660, I don't know. But he boils a bunch of urine down until he gets, like, salt, like a weird, nasty, salty, like, goop. And that salt turned out to be, I want to say sodium phosphate, but more on that later. So anyway, what he did was he heated this goopy salt up until, like, his apparatus was, like, red hot. And all of a sudden, these glowing fumes start filling up his glass. And this liquid comes out that ends up bursting into flames. So he ends up catching the liquid in a jar, and he covers it, and it cools down, and it solidifies. This strange new substance is glowing, which is like, back in the day, if something glows, it's got to be magic, okay? So he was like, holy shit, I think I did it. Oh my God, I think I did it. It turns out this is not the Philosopher's Stone. However, he names this substance after its glow. And the Greek word for light-bearing or light-bear is phosphor. So he calls this element phosphorus. Now, if you go on the periodic table, you'll find phosphorus. And what's really cool about this is this is the first time in recorded human history that an element has been like synthesized in a laboratory. Okay, like no other time has an element been isolated chemically. It's always just been dug up from the earth. So it's really exciting, like from a chemist's perspective. And anyway, so interestingly enough, phosphorus, its symbol is P, which is really funny, like the letter P on the periodic table, which I just think is great. So he makes this material, and he writes down a recipe, which we still use to this day, which is insane. We don't use P, but we use other methods, but similar chemical recipe. So he's falling on hard times. He ends up selling his recipe to a guy named Robert Boyle. Chemists or people in chemistry class will know Robert Boyle is responsible for a lot of gas laws, but that doesn't matter. The point is, he gives it to Robert Boyle, who realizes that, hey, this thing, phosphorus, it cannot be divided into any simpler substance, which means that the four elements, those are not the most pure substances on Earth. In fact, the four elements, I'll show you later, like they can be subdivided into what we now call elements. And he develops the first working definition for an actual chemical element, which is where we sort of start to segue into chemistry, which I'm super excited to talk about.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
Decide